My apologies. I'm just trying to get a view of some information I need to call up. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sarah Stalker, and I am the webinar facilitator for Contact North. This afternoon, we are providing you a presentation on the monthly EOIS CaMS DSQ Report 64. It contains a great deal of information about the LBS performance measures and the service quality standard for which service providers are accountable to the ministry. In today's presentation, we'll learn more about reading and interpreting the DSQ data and applying the information to your own LBS program. We would like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, we would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we each call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. Our webinar this afternoon is being moderated by Anne-Marie Wazlowski from Literacy Northwest and by Jeremy Marks from Literacy Link South Central. They will be watching for any comments and questions we have, and we invite any of our deaf participants or those hard of hearing to raise their hands by using the icons at the bottom of the screen to let us know if they would like to be on camera to pose a question or comment in ASL. I'm going to introduce our presenter for this afternoon. Barb Glass is stepping in to present on behalf of Robin Cook Ritchie, who can't join us. Barb's teaching career began in the then York Region Board of Education. In 1990, she relocated to North Bay and spent 23 years at Canadore College, teaching and coordinating adult upgrading and pre-apprenticeship programs. Subsequently, Barb moved to Conestoga College as chair, preparatory programs, followed by a 3-year tenure at Niagara College as associate dean, access programs. In 2016, Barb began her current position as executive director of the College Sector Committee. Over to you, Barb. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for the introduction and for the land acknowledgement. And I would like to thank Rebecca and Carolyn, our ASL interpreters, for being here with us today as well. And in advance, thanking our moderators, Jeremy and Anne-Marie, who will help keep an eye on the chat and help keep the presentation flowing and give me any little heads up if I'm speaking too fast or too slowly or need to alert folks to some questions. So I'm very pleased to be here today to talk about the detail. I know many of you know Robin Cook Ritchie as well. She and I have a very long history of working together in the LBS and adult ed field. And in fact, she and I had discussed whether she would do the presentation today or I would, and we decided that she would. And then unfortunately at the last minute, she had a little bit of an emergency come up. So here I am. I will say that the slide deck was mostly created by Robin. So just bear with me, because as you probably know, when you don't create a slide deck and you're working through it, it's a little bit different than when you create your own slide deck and you're working through it. So but again, the content is familiar. Robin and I have both over the years done some presentations either together or separately on today's topic. So very pleased to be here. I want to just preface the actual content by saying just a few things about the kind of the nature of the discussion today and the information that I'm hoping to convey and to collaborate with you on. The detailed service quality report is it's probably the most important report that we use in LBS because it does relate directly back to our performance measures. When we do sessions like this, there's often questions around the interpretation of certain pieces, which in some ways is a little bit out of scope of today's discussion. I also feel we could probably spend about 5 hours on this topic instead of an hour and a little bit. So I'll try to move through as quickly as possible, but I will also try to address your questions as best I can. So having said that, I will also just very briefly draw your attention to the slide that's on the screen now about the pop-up PD in general. Many of you have participated in other pop-up PD sessions. We have a great lineup upcoming through the next several months. In addition to presenting today, I'm on the coordinating committee for the pop-up PD group. So I will just tell you to stay tuned and you can access some information. As you can see here, the presentations, recording links, and transcripts are here afterward. You can send us some topic ideas for future sessions if you would like. And we always ask you, if possible, to complete a quick evaluation at the end. And if you do and you add your name, you can be entered in there for a $25 gift card. So having your feedback at the end is always helpful for planning and also for reporting back to the ministry on how things are going with this particular set of webinars that we're doing this year. So I have my little chat box open here, and I'm going to try to keep an eye on it a little bit, but we'll rely on our moderators to alert me to questions. I'll try to pause at the end of every few slides to address any questions that have come up. And Jeremy, Anne-Marie, if I forget to pause, please just jump in and say, Barb, you should pause for a second here, and I'll be happy to do that. So we're going to frame today's discussion as we talk about the different performance measures for LBS in terms of what they are and managing the processes around collecting good data. Some little bit of a discussion of how to try to ensure we have as much integrity and accuracy as possible in our data. And then briefly, a little bit of an analysis, what might this data tell me? How might I use it to enhance my performance measures and my performance around the LBS services that I'm providing through my organization? I think judging, I had a quick little look through the participants list. I think there's some of you who are quite familiar with the DSQ, some of you less familiar, but there's no inappropriate questions or no dumb questions. You are welcome to ask a question, and if I can't address it, I will let you know, and if I can, I will be happy to do so. But don't feel intimidated by the fact that you have a greater or lesser degree of familiarity with the DSQ. We're all just here to collaborate and share some information. So let's just start with a little bit of a reminder to ourselves of all these various reports that are available to us in the EOIS reporting site. And you may or may not have access to this site, but someone at your organization will. It depends on the permission level that you have in EOIS. You can see here with the star beside it, there's the report we're going to talk about today, the detailed service quality report. I just want to draw your attention a little bit to what we call the roll-up reports as well, though. So you can also access, if you select roll-up reports, when you get onto the reporting site, you can access provincial or regional reports with all of the same data parameters in them. So if you want to look at Western region and how they're doing in their DSQ performance measures for all of the service providers, the colleges, the school boards, the community-based, all the different cultural streams, all of that's rolled up into a Western region report. Similarly with the other reports on the screen now, they also have regional or provincial versions. So sometimes it's kind of interesting, to say, okay, well, my organization is sitting at X percentage on this measure, and let's see how we compare to the provincial or the regional measure with all the service providers combined. And I'm just toggling back and forth between a couple of different screens here, so please do bear with me for a minute. So although we're going to talk today in detail about Report 64, I'm going to just highlight a couple of other reports and what they're used for. Again, you may be familiar with them already. So 60B is the All Data Service Plan Profile Report. And it's a summary of all the profile information for all of the learners that you have in your system at the time for the current reporting period. 60D is just related to outcomes and follow-ups, but it's kind of helpful sometimes if you want to look at the summary data for 3 and 6 and 12-month follow-ups. Report 61 is that great big huge Excel sheet with rows and rows and rows and rows and rows. And it has all of the case activity fields for each individual service plan that you have open, approved, active, or have been closed during the reporting period. And it's produced weekly. So it's a hard one to navigate, and we've had some requests through Pop-Up PD to perhaps have a session on looking through the LBS Report 61 as well. So we may be able to do that in the future. It's a really neat one because it's in Excel, so you can manipulate the data yourself if you choose to do that. So I'm just looking back at the chat here. I don't see any questions so far. So here's the star of the show today. Report 64, the DSQ as we call it, the Detailed Service Quality Report. The reason it's the most important one is because it is actually specifically related to the performance measures that we as LBS providers are directly accountable for in our funding agreements with the ministry. So this is the big shebang. This is the big one. You or your program manager or whoever does it in your organization has to reference this report and the performance measures that come out on the report when we do our interim LBS and final LBS reports. So the interim report's coming up. This is the narrative report I'm speaking of. Your organization will have to submit that in later October, and then the final report for the fiscal year is due the following April. So it's a really big one, and it's a really important one to understand where the data is coming from. So I mentioned a moment ago that Report 64 shows the actual measures and performance commitments. And they are broken down into 3 different areas called customer service, effectiveness, and efficiency. And each of those has little subcategories or sub-measures underneath those 3 dimensions. But if you've been around LBS for a little while, you're probably, you've probably heard these 3 terms quite a bit. So now let's talk a little bit more specifically about where that data in the Report 64 comes from to start with. You might have also heard of or seen on some of the reports and in the ministry guidelines and so on, reference to phase 2A. So phase 2A just refers to the fact that when the performance management framework that includes all these measures first came in to being back in 2011-12, that was phase 1 or 1B or 1A, the first phase. Then things changed a little bit in 2013-14. The ministry decided to make some changes to some of the ways these things were measured or how they were or weren't included in the performance management measures and so on. So that was called phase 2A. So we've been in phase 2A since I think 13-14. There is such a thing as phase 2B or not 2B, just kidding. There is phase 2B, which may at some point be implemented, but at this point, I think it's safe to say we're going to be in phase 1A for, just refer to different ways that performance measures are or are not counted. This is what we're currently working with. So let's talk a little bit more about these dimensions and measures. Customer service is the first dimension, and it contains measures for customer satisfaction and service coordination. Each of the measures, as you can see, is weighted. So this is kind of like, if you take a course and your instructor says your assignments are going to be worth 50% of your grade, and your tests are going to be worth 30% of your grade, and your final exam is going to be worth 20% of your grade. Each of those areas is weighted, and under assignments, there's different assignments. Under tests, there's different tests. So it's kind of analogous to that. We end up with a score at the end of the day around these measures. And that score is called the SQS, or Service Quality Standard value. We're not going to talk much about the SQS today because we're not really talking about the calculations. We're talking about the measures themselves. So in terms of the numbers, what we're really wanting to focus on is the fact that there is a different weighting or level of importance to these different measures within the detailed service quality report. So effectiveness, to move on to that, is our suitability features and learner progress, which is the milestones, and efficiency is how many learners are we serving. So these are the ones that you could compare when you look at your own detailed service quality report with the provincial or the regional measures. If you want to do that, sometimes an interesting exercise. So I mentioned a minute ago that, potentially in phase B, if it ever gets implemented, some of these weightings will change, but we don't have any information on 2B yet. So just a little heads up that when you see a reference to phase 2B, that refers to some future state that we don't know anything about yet. If, in fact, we did move into phase 2B, then there would be 2 more measures added in to, go back one slide. There would be a couple more measures added into effectiveness if we moved into phase 2B. And those would be related to completion and learner gains. But those are not part of what we're currently measured on. I will say, though, that if you look at your DSQ, you will see data around completions and around learner gains, but those do not count at all into our final score at the end of the day on which we're measured. But the data comes out in the DSQ, but it's not currently used by the ministry in analyzing our specific performance related to that kind of report card measurement. Okay, and again, just bear with me here. I'm checking the chat. I don't see anything in there just yet. Sarah has made a note that the presentation will be posted and you'll be able to access it afterward if you wish. So let's move on to a little bit of a more detailed discussion of some of the measures. So under that dimension being the big umbrella term, customer service. Customer service is worth 40% of our grade. It's worth 40% of our, final score that we get each month on how we're doing and at the end of the year. And again, that's how we're doing based on the ministry's level of importance that they're attaching to these different measures. So when you think of customer service being worth 40% of the total, then it tells you that that's a pretty, it's a pretty significant emphasis that the ministry is putting on customer service. So the two little measures under customer service, and I'm sure you're familiar with them, customer satisfaction and service coordination. Customer satisfaction measures when learners exit from the program, how many of them on a scale of 1 to 5, when we administer the exit survey, are giving us a 4 or a 5 in the question that says, would you recommend this program to others? Now, that may not be the exact wording on the exit survey or on the exit form. But of all the different questions that might be asked on the exit form, the only one that actually feeds into this measure is that question of, would you recommend this program to others? So if the learner gives you a 4 or a 5 on the scale, then you get a checkbox for customer satisfaction. If they give you a 1, a 2, or a 3, you don't get a checkbox, and it doesn't count toward your customer satisfaction measure. I'm just going to pause there. Again, look at the chat. Has anyone ever had difficulty having learners respond to the questions? In my experience, Nicolette, absolutely. Trying to get people, including ourselves, to respond to things like exit surveys and satisfaction surveys and so on, I think is an ever increasing challenge in our world, where every organization, it seems, that we interact with wants us to do some kind of a customer satisfaction survey. So yes, Nicolette, I would say part of our challenge is trying to find different and new and meaningful ways to get students to get learners to complete that survey when they're exiting. See a couple of other questions in the chat. I just going to briefly address Mike's, because Mike, in asking this question, I think it's super valid. What I can say, though, is currently that doesn't count officially toward any measures in terms of have their employment skills improved. So if they say they haven't, it's unfortunate, but it doesn't affect negatively this customer satisfaction measure at this point. What percentage response, Linda's asking, to the exit survey? Is there, what percentage response is there to the exit survey? Percentage response is the stat. Okay, we don't have this particular report. The DSQ doesn't tell us anything about the exit survey. Or are you saying, how do you know what your response rate is? Maybe you can just type into the chat again to clarify that question a little bit, Linda, and I can come back to it. The DSQ report does tell you your response rate. So let's say you have 100 closed files and you got 70 responses to the exit survey, then your response rate is 70%, but that's not what you're measured on. You're not measured on the response rate of how many people respond. You're measured on how many of those 70 who responded have given you a 4 or a 5 on the answer to that one single question. And so Linda's saying, Linda wants to know how many people respond to the survey. Maybe you can throw that into the chat. We could look at the provincial response rate. It varies a lot from organization to organization. If we had time, we could call up the provincial report. We don't really have time to get into that level of detail today, but so Linda's sort of saying, in general, do people respond? My experience in probably managing 10 or 12 or 15 different LBS sites over the years is that if you can get them while they're still in the program, maybe a week or so before they're about to exit, it's a good strategy and a good way to help get a response rate. I certainly I would certainly say that what I've heard is it's much more difficult, obviously, in remote delivery to get people to respond. And I'm also an e-channel manager, and I can say that we do struggle in e-channel in my organization to get people to respond to the exit surveys. So yeah, a few little comments in the chat as well. And I will just move along to just keep things going in terms of our look at the DSQ. I always find that when I do DSQ sessions, it's a vehicle for such interesting questions to come up around things related to performance. Maybe they're not necessarily measured, maybe they're related to best practices for other things, such as collecting questions like Mike was referring to and trying to make them spun in as positive a way as possible. So I find that the PD in these sessions extends often way beyond the specific topic we might be talking about. So let's talk a little bit more here about service coordination, and as we move through the customer service dimension. So service coordination, basically a measure of how you as a service provider access supports to and from other partners in your community, community services, training services, educational services, and how you're able to incorporate this into the learner plan and make sure you get it recorded in CaMS. And service coordination is worth 25% of the 40, customer satisfaction worth 15% of the 40. So to go back to my analogy, this is like the assignments, and these are like the sub-assignments that make up your 40% of your grade. A little bit of a deeper dive into customer satisfaction for a second. I kind of got ahead of myself a little bit, which again is sometimes what happens when you use someone else's PowerPoint. So the customer satisfaction measure is based only on closed service plans. That's important to remember. So it is a measure at exit, and it doesn't get incorporated into the DSQ until the service plan's closed. And here it is again, on a scale of 1 to 10, or a scale of 1 to 5, those who respond with a rating of 4 or 5. And you're getting this information from the participant exit form. And the target, and the targets are important to talk about, is 90%. So the ministry wants us to have 90% of our respondents giving us a rating of 4 or 5. So again, it's not 90% response rate to the question or the survey. It's for those who responded, 90% should be giving you a 4 or a 5 in order to meet the measure. If you look at the provincial reports, the customer satisfaction measure is usually pretty high. Like overall, I think the field does very well with that. So again, just taking a pause, looking back to the chat for a second. So I'm going to think I have to pick up the pace a bit here because there's still quite a bit to get through. So I don't want to talk too fast because that's not nice for the interpreters nor for you as participants. So let's talk quickly about managing this data. Do you have a formal way of collecting it? Are you intentional about making sure as many learners as possible collect this learner satisfaction survey? Do you keep it in the learner file? Because if you have, like everything else, if it's not in the file, it didn't happen. So it's important to have a record of your issuing and completion of the exit survey. Is the customer satisfaction data collected at points other than exit? So technically, this is something that we should be administering at exit. You may decide to collect customer satisfaction data at different points in the program. That's fine. It certainly is a good practice for program improvement. But the ministry's intention with this particular measure is that we are collecting it, at exit, or, like I said, maybe within a week or so of exiting if the person's leaving. Certainly is harder to get from the lost contact folks, that's for sure. And I'm just going to go back to the chat here a little So Heather says, Heather from Quill, well, it's sometimes difficult to get a good response rate. There's usually an area the programs can indicate to the ministry they are working on improving to have a better and accurate picture of how learners feel. Yeah, because if you're not meeting the measure, you know, it is in those reports, we do have to provide strategies as to how we're going to improve. So that's a good point, Heather. Lisa mentioned that our exit survey includes all this information for CAMS, but there's way more important information we collected exit that the ministry isn't asking for. I'm kind of glad you mentioned that, Lisa, because I did mean to say at the beginning that these performance measures are the ones that the ministry deems as important to ensure that we, as funded providers, are complying with what is in our LBS agreements. As educators and as people who maybe, you know, have a considerable academic background in adult education and so on, these aren't necessarily the measures that tell us what we want to know about our programming. So Lisa, I think that's a really good point. And there's nothing to stop you from asking more questions than the ministry requires, as Lisa points out. So these measures we're talking about today are what the ministry considers as most important in our performance as service providers. And we could have a lively discussion about other measures that are also, as Lisa mentions, perhaps considerably more important to the success of the students. Okay. Let's move along here, and I'll go to the quick little analysis piece, which we've kind of already talked about because we've been talking about how we use this data. And if you're not reaching the 90% measure, you know, here's some of the things that you might consider doing. Asking learners why they aren't satisfied. And again, that's sometimes why it's helpful to do some of these check-ins partway through your program. So you have time while the learners are still in the program to address some of their concerns if possible. So that comes to surveying them more frequently. Have a suggestion box. So some of the things that might come out of those suggestions would be your hours of operation. You know, are there a number of learners who or don't feel your hours of operation are meeting their needs? You might consider some short-term programming options if that might help satisfaction and helping the students to meet their goals. So let's talk, moving on to service coordination. I know you're all familiar with referrals. This is also a measure based on closed service plans. And you know, you will know we have referred ins, referrals in, we have referrals out. And important thing to know is that certain referrals in or out don't actually count toward our credit for these measures. So there are 3 sources of information where this service coordination measure on the DSQ comes from. A referred in status when a service plan is open, and you capture that on the PRF. If somebody is referred in, there's a spot on the participant registration form to note that. You can have a referral during service. So let's say I'm in your LBS program and I need a referral to my local affordable housing office, for example, then that would be a referral during service. And you would enter that as a sub goal underneath your learner plan. Or you might refer me out at exit to somewhere. And that also can be noted in as a sub goal. But this is in big letters for a reason. If you have a referral in the category of LBS, so if another service provider is referring, if another LBS service provider refers me to you, or I've got informal or word of mouth referrals or media, those are not included. They don't count if that's the referral in that you have on the service plan. I'm going to editorialize just for a second and say that I think I've always been puzzled by the fact that the referrals in from our own LBS colleagues don't count. I know why the ministry says that because they're already in an LBS program, but I think, you know, in my little editorial comment, which I'll try not to make too many of today, I feel like if we're getting referrals in from our LBS partners, that's a really good thing. So yes, referrals at entrance do count as well. So we'll delve a little bit deeper into how they count here. And once again, the target is 50%. So the ministry is asking us to aim to have at least 50% of the service plans with at least one referral in or out. So in terms of how we might manage these, you know, if there is a referral in, and there isn't always, but if there is a referral in that counts, make sure we're recording it. Are we tracking those referrals I was mentioning during service and recording them on the learner plan and adding a sub goal in CaMS? Are we recording the referrals made at exit to make sure we can get credit for those? And do we keep additional documentation related to referrals in the learner file? Because the ministry does want to see some evidence of that referral, even if it's just a quick email, or maybe you have a checklist in your agency of different referral sources and dates. And so lots of different ways to tracking those referrals. And in terms of integrity, the data integrity is a little bit like the management here. Are you really making sure that the not only are you recording the referrals in and or out in your files and on the learner plan, but are you getting them into CaMS in the sub goals? And, you know, as a double check in the third bullet here, before you close the plan, are you double checking that all those referrals got in there? Mike's got a good question that comes up all the time. What information should be documented in the file to prove the referral out? Is a referral slip enough? I feel, Mike, it's unfortunate to say that it varies a little bit among ETCs across the province and what they will, quote, accept as valid documentation in the file. Some over the years have required proof that the learner has actually followed up with the referral. Others have been fine with just, you know, say that email in the file that has connected, perhaps connected the learner with another service or an appointment card or something like that. So, Mike, there's not a hard and fast answer to that question because unfortunately it's not consistently applied. You know, more is better, but if you can do your best at documenting those referrals and justify to your ETC, should you have a file audit as to how you're doing it, that's the best you can do. And I'm sorry to be a bit vague on that, but there really isn't anything ever provided to us in writing about the type of documentation or the length of it or the quality of it or anything else. So there's a real big variety in how people document their referrals. And if you have other thoughts on that, feel free to weigh in on the chat here. Ghislaine says we've created a common referral form to share with other services in the community. That is something I've heard of where there is, you know, if your community is fairly cooperative around referrals, that's sufficient and works well in some communities. Kathy's mentioned the policy states that verbal confirmation is sufficient. Depending where we refer them, we ask for a business card at least. So yep, that's another good example of a different, of a way to document them. So lots of good ideas, and thank you for sharing those. Oops, sorry, I went down instead of up instead of down. So you really, really do, I'm gonna emphasize this one more time, to be sure you're understanding which referrals in and out do count. Every LBS report, and again, I apologize, I meant to mention this at the beginning, there is a report guide that is available on the reporting website that walks you through basically what we're talking about today in a little more detail. So for example, in the report 64 guide, there's a list of all the different referral types, and you would see them in CaMS in the dropdown, and which are acceptable and count as referrals in or out, and which don't. But the only ones that don't, referrals in from LBS or the informal word of mouth referral. But you do still want to capture that, because you do want to know where your learners are coming from and still document those referrals, even though technically those two categories of referrals in do not count. And if you went to the, another little interesting aside, if you went to either your own DSQ, but certainly if you went to the regional or provincial ones, usually the biggest referral source is word of mouth. I think that says something pretty positive about us in the LBS world of service provision, that we have a lot of people in our programs who say to their friends, family, colleagues, whatever, hey, that's a good program. You know, if you need to do this and that, why don't you contact Mike at this program, or why don't you go online and have a look at their website. So I think it's great that we have a huge proportion of word of mouth referrals, because I think it speaks really highly of the field and the work that we do, even though technically it doesn't count in terms of our scorecard with the ministry. Pause for a sec. I'm going to take a water break for 1 minute. And Lisa's mentioned in the chat, it's been our understanding that the formal referral needs to be more about the consistency of your referral process than the paperwork involved. I think that's a very good point too, Lisa. You know, you should have a process in place as to how you handle and document your referrals. The ministry looks very positively on the fact that we have processes in place and we have processes documented for these different things that we're doing, and that those processes are consistently applied and understood amongst all of our staff. And yes, Ladine, and I'm sorry if I didn't mention your name, general education development is the GED prep or test. It doesn't distinguish which, it's just the GED. So you may refer somebody to the GED, another organization that does GED prep, or you may refer them directly for the test, but there isn't really a firm distinction between that. I see Denise has also commented about the word of mouth. Yeah, I don't think you can't say it any better than that, Denise. Our word of mouth referrals don't count, and yet it's in marketing, word of mouth is a huge positive piece of data. And then another question, can GLA, Good Learning Anywhere, be a referral for Aboriginal services or something along those lines? So GLA is one of the 5 LBS e-channel providers. So technically GLA is a referral to another LBS organization. I can't tell you what to do, but I would say perhaps referral to Aboriginal services could be something that you could count it as. I have to be, I want to be careful about what I say you could and couldn't do, because I'm not the ministry, and I'm, yes, someone with several years of experience, but again, if you have a documented reason for that referral and why you're recording it as such, then it's in the file and it's documented, and if you ever had to defend it, you could. And I mean defend it in terms of a file audit. So let's just zip through here to the next slide. So in terms of, you know, again, we've not gotten ahead of ourselves exactly, but we've addressed some of this a little bit already. When we're talking about meeting the service coordination target of 50%, if you're not meeting it, you can use Report 60V to give you a summary of where your referrals in and out are coming from. So if you're looking and you say, wow, I've got loads of referrals from OW, I don't have many from employment services, maybe that's a referral relationship I want to cultivate. Again, capturing all the referrals that take place, having that consistent process in place in your organization for documenting referrals and getting them into CaMS, perhaps raising it at the LSP meetings. And I won't go to these links right now, but there are a couple of resources here that you can access when you look at the presentation after that may be helpful as well. So again, just moving my chat around here a little bit. And going back to see a comment here, just 1 second. Okay, so Lisa has mentioned as well, the other issue is that only one referral counts. Yep. Lots of multi-referrals, but some count more than others based on the ministry guidelines. If you're capturing metrics for other funders, then claim all referrals as they will be looked at from multiple stakeholders. So, yep, very good point. Technically, you only need one referral in or out to count in the performance measurement framework toward that service coordination measure. The ministry really wants us to capture all of the referrals we do so that they're in the learner plan and they create a, I've heard the ministry use the term, so that they tell a story of what the learner is doing. So even though technically you only need one referral in or out to count and to get the tick box and to get your credit toward the 50% measure, I think Lisa's advice here is sound. Try and capture as many referrals as you can. Okay. Just going to back up once or twice. So we throw around a lot of percentages in these discussions. So I just want to recap for a second that within customer service, which overall counts for 40%, service coordination counts for 25 of the 40%, and the target measure is 50%, which means we are being asked to ensure that at least 50% of our closed learner plans have at least one referral. So sometimes in these discussions, the percentages can get a bit confusing. That's why I just wanted to restate that. So go back to where we left off here. So we've talked about the customer service dimension. Second dimension is effectiveness. So again, we could have a long discussion about other ways to measure effectiveness that are meaningful for our programs and our learners. These 4 items are the way the ministry views effectiveness and the way they track it and the way they measure us on it. Suitability, we're all familiar with the suitability indicators. We'll talk a little more about that. They're currently worth 20% of the 50. Learner progress, which is successful completion of at least one milestone, is 30% of the 50. And this, I'm going to repeat what I said earlier. These 2 measures are recorded on the DSQ, but currently there is no value attached to them. They don't actually count right now in phase 2B of this performance measurement framework. They may in the future, they may not, we don't know. They're in there, and they're tracked on the DSQ, but they don't count toward our scorecard or our measures. And if you're wondering why I'm pausing, it is just because I am trying to keep a little eye on the chat here. And as Lisa also points out, it's worthwhile to look at those completion stats. Learner gains is completely off the map right now because there is no tool in use to measure learner gains, which just as a very, very brief review, the learner gains measure was originally intended to be in a pre and a post test given to all learners to measure their essential skill gains in one or more essential skills. So the ministry has over the years piloted and experimented with different tools that could be used for the learner gains measure. Some of you have probably been involved in some of those pilots. My organizations have been involved in those pilots, but they have yet to land on a tool or a suite of tools that they would have us use for learner gains. So there should never be anything in CaMS in your DSQ related to learner gains. And if there is, you probably want to look at your DSQ and figure out why the DSQ shows some measure around learner gains. Okay, suitability, one of our favorites. Here's the suitability indicators, and there are 12 of them. They are on the participant registration form, but interesting, they're captured in different places in CaMS. They're not all kind of grouped together in CaMS. So you can't go into CaMS and look for a suitability screen. And I'll show you in a moment the different places in CaMS where some of these things are captured. So in general, for some of these, the learner is self-identifying. In some of them, they're captured in the education section. But these are the 12 suitability indicators that we currently are working with right now. And they are, I will say, they are old. They were developed in, I'm going to say about 2009-10, when this performance management framework was not even released yet. And, you know, many people have had discussions over the years about the fact that perhaps they could be updated. Some are more applicable to certain delivery sectors or cultural streams than others. So lots of discussion, and I'm sure you've been aware of it over the years around suitability indicators. But this is what we are currently working with. And so when we are in CaMS, we have information around the person homepage and the client summary related to these indicators. And the target is 30%. So it's important to talk a little bit about how we get to that 30%. Sorry, I'm just going to back up a little bit here. I think I'll stay on this slide for a moment. Once again, I'm a bit less familiar with the order of the slides. Nancy has a comment. It says between 45 and 64. However, we've been told that's necessarily written down anywhere. And if your file were audited, Nancy, my interpretation is that if the learner's birth date indicates they're over 65 and you have recorded this as a suitability indicator, then what's in your paper file is not going to match what is in CaMS. So I think it's another good example of inconsistent messaging by the ministry. And I think it potentially could result in a file audit question if the next ministry representative came to audit your files and said to you, well, Barb's birth date shows that she's 69, but she only started your program 6 months ago, and you have that she's in between 45 and 64. So explain that to me. So Nancy, not saying that you shouldn't do it because you were told that by the ministry representative that you could, but it's just raising a flag that it could create issues down the road in a file audit. And Kathy makes a good point, get it in writing. And so good, that's good that you have it in writing, Nancy. Super. It isn't to say that your next ETC will agree with it. Just want to put that out there. I also want to point out that even though there's 10 indicators, number 2, 3, and 4 are lumped in as one. So if someone is an WODSP recipient, that's great. You get the check for that suitability indicator, or if they're no source of income, or if they're a Crown ward. But these are all grouped under that sort of income status. And you couldn't have someone checking more than one of these boxes. It's one or the other. So that's sometimes a little bit confusing. Lots of interpretation questions around some of these, and they're not well defined anywhere. So over the years, I've had, done many workshops and had many discussions about, well, as Jackie's alluding to, more than 6 years out of education versus more than 6 years without training. What does training mean? Some ETCs might tell you that training means, St. John's CPR first aid for 8 hours or 2 days. Some might say it means training means a 6-week heavy equipment operator program. Some means training is you've engaged in privacy training at your last job. So there's no real solid definition of what more than 6 years without training is. More than 6 years without education is a little bit easier to interpret. But again, we don't have time to talk a lot about interpretation today. But to go back to your question, Jackie, for more than 6 years without training, can this be checked if they've never been involved in a training program? Yeah. Yep, I think that's a pretty solid yes. So to get the 30%, what you really need to think of is that you need each of your learners to come in with with 3 of the 12. I'll rephrase that. This is always a little bit hard to define accurately. You need to get 3 suitability indicators from each learner to more or less get to the 30% target. But remember that because 2, 3, and 4 here are all lumped together as 1, it really means you need 3 of 10, not 3 of 12. Because you couldn't get all of these 3 or more than 1. You can only have 1 source of income in this particular box. So on average, if you're getting 3 suitability indicators out of your learners, then you're going to meet the 30%. If one learner has 1 suitability indicator and another has 5, you're still going to be approaching that 30% in the number of suitability indicators that are checked. I wish we could spend a whole probably half hour talking about the suitability calculations. What some of the things that are important around it though is that, and we'll get to this in a second. I'm actually not going to jump ahead, sorry. I'm going to go back to the chat first. Lisa says we've had big conversations about no source of income. If the check isn't in the learner's name, they have no source of income. This plays into conversations of parental income or spousal income that may be denied to a learner. Absolutely, Lisa. Big conversations. Yeah. And years ago, just in the college sector, we did a bit of an analysis about what does no source of income mean, just because we were kind of interested. And, sometimes it was spouses who don't work and who rely on the income of their partner, or young people who live at home and don't have an income and therefore are relying on their parents or their grandparents or whatever. So yeah, Lisa, big conversations around that. So I've just advanced one slide here. And so how are we going to manage suitability so we're getting the full advantage of these indicators? And yes, you can get a copy of the deck. Amy, it'll be available on the Pop-Up PD website. There'll be a link in there at the end, and you will be able to provide a copy of it. Sarah Stalker will send out sort of a group email to all the people who are registered with the information about how to access it. So how are we going to get these indicators and get them recorded? First of all, are your learners filling out, or are you helping them to fill out the PRF completely and accurately? Do your staff understand which items on the PRF relate to those 12 suitability indicators to make sure that they're all recorded as accurately as possible? And do you update both the PRF and the CaMS person homepage if a client self-identifies after you take them in? So, I think one of the best examples we all think about is our is persons with disabilities, because many people are reluctant, for example, to disclose that they may have a disability when they first enter the program. But once they've been in the program and they're a little bit more comfortable, or you've had more in-depth conversations with them, you might find out through their disclosure that they do have a learning disability of some sort, or a physical disability. So fine, you can go back to the participant registration form, and you can ask them to check that box again, or put a note in the file that they have disclosed this, and then you can go back and change it in CaMS. So One strategy that I think has really proved effective over the years is revisiting some of the indicators with students if you have time once they're in the program. I think sometimes we're all reluctant to self-disclose certain things when we're registering for a new program or service. And so if we can help make our clients and learners comfortable once they're in the program for a little while, then often they may disclose further. They may not have wanted to disclose that they're from a particular cultural stream when they first came in, but maybe they would when they're a little more comfortable with the program. And so in terms of integrity, again, are you checking CaMS to make sure that the information is correct? Does everybody have a client summary in CaMS? Because if you don't have a client summary, this information is not being captured. And you can use the report 60B to determine if client summaries are missing, because there is a field on that report 60B that says client summary, yes, no. So the client summary is a key piece in CaMS to make sure is up to date in order for you to be capturing as many suitability indicators and getting as many ticky boxes as you can toward that 30%. I will say, again, just going to editorialize a minute here about suitability. There are certain geographical areas in which it's generally harder or easier to get suitability indicators. And I'm speaking very broadly here. So for example, often at remote sites, clients may have more suitability indicators because they haven't had perhaps as many access to different services over the years. One thing that's become more apparent to many providers during COVID is that the learners who are able to engage remotely tend to have fewer suitability indicators because they generally have fewer barriers. So some really kind of fascinating analysis about suitability indicators that's coming out, particularly related to COVID and remote delivery. So that's I'll stop my editorial again there. A couple of items in the chat here. And scroll up a bit so I don't miss anything. Bear with me here, just going back there. But so Sarah also posted a link in the chat to the site where the resources and PowerPoints are posted. So Lisa mentions that they have a suitability criteria list on every coordinator's desk that has bullet points for each criterion so that they were aware and reminded at every point of the learner interaction and data collection. So that's an example of an internal process.
For the interpreter, can you not read it that quickly? Slow down a little bit. Thank
you. Yep, I will. So it says, Lisa has indicated, we posted a suitability criteria list on every coordinator's desk that has bullet points for each criteria so that they're aware and reminded at every point in the learner interaction and data collection, and aware basically that it's never too late to collect more suitability indicators as long as the file is still open. Lisa also says we kept that for a year, and the info and decision making, oops, I lost my place here, just a sec, is ingrained in staff. So that's a good example also of an internal process that everyone understands and that the staff uses, and that helps contribute to this particular measure and getting as many indicators checked off as possible. Maria mentioned that they have included a suitability list for each file. So that's another approach, is having a suitability list actually in each file. Kathy mentioned anytime information on the PRF changes, there should always be a date on the change. Yep, good point. If you do change something on the PRF, so if someone discloses another indicator and you go and check off that on the PRF, putting a little date and initial is a good thing, so that when you go back to it, if you have a file audit, you have a sort of a recollection in your mind, and for the ministry that was something that was added later after the initial completion of the PRF. Jeremy's put a little reminder in the chat that if you are able to complete the evaluation form, you have the option of being entered in a draw for a gift certificate. So that's our advertising break for the moment. All righty, now my cursor is just being a little particular here. So we'll scroll a bit further through down the chat. Sorry for the delay. Okay, I think I'm caught up now. Yeah, okay. So as we conclude our discussion of suitability, again, you can look at report 60B if you'd like to have a summary of your suitability indicators. So you might have lots with less than grade 12. You might not have a lot with less than grade 12. You might have lots that have checked off the OW box or ODSP. You may not. So report 60B gives you a much more detailed look at your suitability indicators, the most common ones, the ones you don't have many of, and so on. You may want to think, if you're struggling with suitability, how you can better target some underrepresented groups that would increase your suitability. When the suitability indicators were developed as part of the original performance management framework, it was developed as a way to help quantify the barriers that our learners have. And so that's another way to think of suitability. It's trying to attach a value, right or wrong, because we're not here to argue the right or wrong. We're just here to talk about the real, what is. And so the suitability indicators are intended to be a quantitative measure of some of the barriers that would most affect our learners. And kind of the flip side of that, in the way that the ministry looks at it, is, are we serving the people for whom the program is intended? And if we are meeting the suitability indicator measure of 30%, then the ministry is pretty satisfied that we are serving the learners who can benefit most from the program. Lisa has an item in the chat. That is a good point about changes. Oops. We are going to purely digital files. There won't be any handwritten changes to a PRF. Any thoughts about amendments to the PRF? Make a copy and redate the file name. Interesting, Lisa, because I know many of us are moving to more digitized files, and I think we'll have to figure out our own ways of verifying some of those things, like date changes. If you're not using a paper copy anymore, and the ministry hasn't weighed in on anything around requirements for digital files. So again, we're all just kind of doing things as clearly and carefully and accurately as we can. So maybe others want to weigh in about any thoughts to making amendments to the participant registration form when you have a digital version of it. I think Lisa, making a copy and redating it, I mean, that's certainly one way. Feel free to respond to Lisa's question in the chat if you like. Anne-Marie mentions a new question regarding underrepresented groups has been added to the 22-23 LSP template. Interesting. Thanks for that, Anne-Marie. All right, how are we doing for time? So we're at 3:09, so I'm going to have to pick up the pace a little bit here. We've talked about some other ways to try and get more suitability indicators out of the, to help our clients feel comfortable disclosing. So that relationship of trust, explaining that there might be supports available related to some of those suitability indicators, and certainly making sure that helping them to understand what they are actually filling out in the PRF. And Christine's posted a chat question, and I'll let Lisa or others respond to that, because it's a little bit, certainly a good question, but a little bit out of scope for what we're talking about just in this part of the presentation. So under effectiveness, we have a second measure, which is learner progress. It's for 30% of the 50. Sorry, it's for 20%. That's a typo. No, it's for 30%. Sorry, I'm getting confused on my own percentages here. It's an interesting measure for a couple of reasons. The measures we've talked about so far, like we talked about customer satisfaction is measured at exit, service coordination comes into the measures at exit in a closed plan. Learner progress is included from both active and closed service plans. And it is the percentage of learners who have successfully completed at least one milestone in the current reporting period. So in order for it to count, that one milestone has to be attained. There isn't a penalty if you have 3 milestones in there and 2 are attained and 1 is not. Doesn't mean you get a black mark against you for the not attained. It means you do get credit for at least having 1 attained. And again, kind of like the referrals, even though only 1 is required to get credit toward this measure, obviously we're all doing more than 1 milestone for the most part, and that, you know, unless the learner's in for a very, very short time. And I'm not going to go back to the chat just now. There's a little bit of a discussion about different digital strategies, which is great. And I encourage you to continue that, but I'll just press on with the content here that we're covering today around the DSQ. And it's fantastic when we get online together and we can share so many of, little offshoots of information that that come up in the chat. I think that's a very positive bonus that comes out of some of our sessions. So in terms of milestone administration, you know, this is again something that you need to make sure that everyone in your organization is aware of the importance of it, of tracking them, of recording them, of learners understanding why they're doing them. Do your instructors have access to them? So I feel like most of us are probably, you know, doing a pretty good job with this particular piece of managing them. And then of course the integrity relates to, is there a process in place to ensure that that information gets into CaMS, and is it updated? And are we making sure that we're double checking that before the file is closed? You can't go back and add milestones after a file's closed. And no problem, Christine. I'm glad you got some information that was helpful out of the chat there. And then our little analysis piece around milestones and the learner progress measure. Are at least 60% of your learners attaining at least 1 milestone? And it has to be within the fiscal year. So in order, if you have carryover learners who are in your program on March 31st, let's say they've completed 2 or 3 milestones, and you roll them over into the new fiscal year in April 1st, and their CaMS file is still open, they need a new milestone after April 1st before you close their file in order to get credit toward the 60% measure for progress. So a lot of us have called April milestone month so that we can make sure we get a milestone in the new fiscal year, especially for learners who are potentially leaving early in the fiscal year. So again, if you look later at the resources, you'll see there's a resource related to the learner progress for measure here as well. And looking at the times, 3:15, a couple more resources that are available later. I would open these up if we had time to give you a quick look at them. But you're certainly welcome to look at them later. And Jackie says we call it the Great Milestone Race. Yes, in April. I think that's another good name for it too. So we come to our last measure, and last but not least is efficiency. And efficiency, of course, is a measure of the number of learners we're serving. And we all have targets in our agreement for the number of learners that we're supposed to serve in a given year. And interestingly, you know, I know we have a lot of stress in our organizations about trying to meet that learner served target. And interestingly, in the performance measurement framework, it has the lowest weighting. Could be argued that that's a good thing, could be argued that it's a bad thing, but I just think it's an interesting thing for the most part. And jumping back to the chat for a sec, Heather from Quill has indicated that tasks on the task-based activities for LBS portal are slowly being updated to include digital versions of each. Thanks for adding that, Heather. I just was reading it and wasn't sure. I couldn't quite see the bottom of it, but thank you for adding that piece about the task-based activities being digitized. So learner served, back to that. What does it actually include? It includes the number of all learners with an active service plan. It's got to be in the active state. It can't be in the open state. It has to be in the active state in CaMS to count. In any fiscal year and any time, only one service plan per learner will count toward your learners served target. So if I come into your program, let's say your target's 100. If I come into your program in April and I leave in September, you close my service plan, you get to count me toward your learner served target. If I come back in December and you open a new plan for me, you don't get to count me again as a unique learner. I just happen to be one learner with two service plans. The only service plans that count, moving to the third bullet, are the ones that have at least one milestone included. And the milestone has to be either in progress or completed to count. So if in my first service plan, I didn't have any milestones that were in progress or completed, I wouldn't have counted toward your learner served target. And then and the last bullet's always interesting. The target is 90%. So the target is that you meet 90% of your learners served target. So if your target is 100, meeting 90 of them would give you 90%. But we're actually committing in our agreements to reaching 100%. So really what that says is we really do need to try as best we can to meet our learners served targets. Yeah, and Heather says, don't be misled by the 10%. Exactly. because even though it's technically worth 10%, as we know, the ministry does place a lot of value with a small v on learners served targets. Danielle says we get a lot of returned students. Would it be recommended to keep them active until closer to the end of fiscal? Well, you might get different answers on that, Danielle. There's not always a benefit in keeping them open till the end of the fiscal year, especially if they're not doing anything. And I mean, if they're finished with you, you should probably close them. If you keep them open longer and there's no activity in their file for 60 days, then obviously they move on to the inactive list, which isn't a penalty, but just is another piece of record keeping you have to attend to. So Lisa says there's a trick with the carryover files though. Yeah, there's a few of them. So Lisa, maybe you want to expand in the chat on what you're referring to. One thing is that the carryovers still count as learners served if they don't complete a milestone in the new year. So what it's Lisa saying, if you have a learner registered in February, they don't need a milestone completed in the February to April. Yes, that's exactly what we were saying. They do need a milestone in the next fiscal. So bottom line is they need at least one milestone attained in each fiscal year. If their service plan carries over and they have a milestone completed before March 31st, and they carry any time during the fiscal year before March 31st, and they carry over to April 1st, they need another milestone in the new fiscal year before you close their plan in order to count toward the progress measure. So I think, Lisa, that's pretty much what you're saying in the chat as well. So thank you for that as well. So yes, it just needs to be in progress to count as a learner, but needs to be attained to count toward the performance measure of learner progress. Jackie, is it true that inactive learners at the year end do not count in the year-end numbers. Inactive learners count because they still have an active service plan. Inactive doesn't mean you have closed their plan. And I think that there's confusion about the active status in CaMS. So their file is active, but if they're on the inactive list, it just means that nobody has touched their file in CaMS for 60 days, but their status is still active. So they do still count toward the learner served target. I kind of think it would have been helpful if the ministry could have thought of a different name for the inactive list. Because I have heard many times confusion over the fact that, active status in CaMS versus the inactive list are not the same things. There's a few new messages in the chat. I'm going to, and we're really getting close to time here. I'm going to leave the chat just for a second. I will come back to it. And in the interest of just finishing off the last couple of slides here and making sure we can kind of round out our discussion today, I'll just proceed. And as I said, come back to the chat in a second. Do we know how many learners we have to serve? So now we're looking at the management and integrity of the learner served data. So do you know what your target is? Is it common knowledge in the organization? Do the people who need to know that information have that information? Do your intake folks know, especially, and those who are managing the CaMS files? Are you able to get the learner plans developed in a timely fashion? Are you able to enter them in CaMS in a timely fashion? If you want to know if all your plans have the active status in the system, you can go to the View My Files on CaMS window. And come back to the milestone discussion, do all those service plans have either a completed or in progress milestone? So if you're not meeting your learner served numbers, I'm sure if you're not, you've probably had lots of these discussions already in your organization. Are there particular client groups in your community that you could target? Again, you can look at report 60B to see where some of your demographics are, where your referrals are or are not coming from. Do you have accessible services and hours for people? Would there be any possibility of offering, new hours or any itinerant services, operating hours, meeting the needs of learners? We've talked about a few of these things earlier in terms of also in terms of customer satisfaction. Do we have our contact information and descriptions on the web are up to date and in social media if we use it, in print material? And is there programming that we can offer that can help our other Employment Ontario colleagues and or Ontario Works? So I'm sure you have lots of other ideas of ways to help meet numbers, but those are just a few. Targeted training is another one. Would it make sense for your organization to target either a particular group or a particular sector of work? If employers in your area are looking for upskilling in a particular area and are happy, quick example, I remember Fleming College a few years ago did a very targeted program in entry-level construction skills. And they had a little numeracy component and a little bit of a document use component and a little bit of a hands-on measuring component. And they did that as a targeted short-term training program because the employers in that area were indicating that there was a huge shortage of entry-level laborers in the construction trade. So this just gave those folks applying for those jobs a bit of a leg up. It wasn't a Fleming College credential. It was just something that they did in LBS to help a local labor market need. A little bit of targeted training resources that you can also access on the Literacy Resources and Discussion Forum if you're interested in learning a little bit more about that. And you can use the search term targeted training. So if you're not familiar with this Resources and Discussion Forum, it is hosted jointly by Community Literacy of Ontario and Laubach Literacy. And Robin, who would have been presenting to you today, is one of her roles is as the Executive Director of Laubach Literacy. So she is actually one of the two organizations that host this site and do a great job in posting lots of different resources on it for our field. We talked a little bit about learner gains and completions being on the radar, but not being in our measurement framework right now. So it's a bit of a stay tuned. They may or may not ever be added back in. They may be added back in a different form at some point, but we have no information about that. So with that, I'm going to take a quick look back at the chat while I leave this slide up. I want to, in case we get a little absorbed in the chat, I want to, at this point, really once again, thank our interpreters, Rebecca and Carolyn, for being with us today and doing the ASL interpretation, and also to thank our moderators today, Jeremy and Anne-Marie. And of course, thanks Sarah for her technical support and assistance. And most of all, to thank all of you for taking this hour and a half out of your day to join us and to do a little bit of a walkthrough of this report, which is a super critical one, as we've discussed. I've spent a full day doing workshops on the DSQ. So I apologize if it seemed like I was rushing through any pieces or didn't get a chance to address everything in the chat, because this is a big, big, big topic, but it's a big, big, important topic. So I hope that you've been able to glean a few pieces of information today, or equally important, that you've been able to share information with some of your colleagues through the chat. You know, excellent, wonderful collaboration that we have on these webinars. So I very much appreciate those of you that were able to weigh in with some thoughts or suggestions or questions, excellent questions as well. There's messages in the chat. We don't really have time to go back to the chat for now, so I'm going to just have to leave it there and turn things back over to our moderators and Sarah.
It's Sarah Stalker speaking. Thank you, Barb, for an excellent presentation. So much to cover. I'm going to ask if either Anne-Marie or Jeremy have any comments before we wrap things up today. I know there's a lot of good observations and points in the chat. I'll be saving that, and the committee will take a look because it looks like we've got some topics to explore further in the future. So any comments, Jeremy, Anne-Marie?
No, I don't have any comments.
Oh, this is Anne-Marie. I don't either, but I'm really pleased with regards to the level of activity that took place in the chat. So I think that also indicates what a good job Barb did in presenting the presentation. Thank you.
I agree. Thank you very much, Barb.
My pleasure. I'm happy that I was able to be with everybody today. And remember to fill out your evaluation. The link's in the chat, and it will be posted after in Sarah's message as well.
Thank you all. And another thanks to our interpreters. We hope that everyone did get something out of today's presentation, but do know that you will be able to look at the resources to give them a little more thought later, and watch for our next pop-up PD. And we hope you'll join us again. Thanks so much, and have a great afternoon, everyone. Bye for now.
Bye.
Bye-bye.